instantly knew, even without the Wonderland reference, who we were going to be talking about. It's 150 years since Alice in Wonderland was first published, and in that time she's gone on to become absolutely integral to our creative landscape. And here she is in her very first incarnation, drawn for the 1865 edition by John Tenniel. John Tenniel wasn't actually a children's illustrator, he was a political cartoonist, and I'm sure at the time he thought the thing that he would be most remembered for was actually being the Punch cartoonist for most of his career. And this is also Alice, drawn by the government war artist and creator of Gorm and Gas, Mervyn Peake. Mervyn Peake spent the war working for the British government, drawing some of the horrors that he saw during the Second World War. And in 1946, when he came back to his real life, the first thing that he drew was Alice. This is Alice drawn in 1959 by the Finnish illustrator Tove Jansson, who of course is most famous as the creator of the Moomins. And this is Alice in probably her most famous and recognisable incarnation, drawn by Mark Davis for Disney Studios in 1951. And this is Alice. In 1988, the Czech surrealist Jan Švankmajer made a rather disturbing, quite frankly, as you can see from this picture film, called Alice. If you ever want to know what Lewis Carroll's nightmares were like, good place to start. And this is Alice, drawn by Melinda Gebbie for Alan Moore's 1991 graphic novel Lost Girls, which also starred Wendy Darling and Dorothy Gale. If you know this book at all, you'll understand I had to be quite careful which picture I chose to show you all. That's pretty much as non-risque as this book gets. This is a Japanese Alice, drawn by Hayao Miyazaki for Studio Ghibli for his 2001 film Spirited Away, in which Chihiro, who is also called Sen in the story, is taken away to a Wonderland-like place. To date, this is the most successful anime film that's ever been made. This is Alice in 1969, drawn by Salvador Dali. He actually did a series of 12 plates for Wonderland. They're very, very hard to find now, but as you can see, it's one of his most beautiful works. This is Alice in the late 1990s, drawn by Harry Trumbaugh for Jeff Noon's novel Automated Alice. Alice is about to pull a lever on the leg of her automated twin Celia. And this is Alice. And this is Alice. And this is Alice. And this is apparently the Mad Hatter. He's clearly been doing some work since he first met John Tenniel. Yeah, if you just want to savour the goodness for a moment now. And this is Charles Dodgson, who wrote as Lewis Carroll in a photograph taken when he was a young man in his 30s. And this is his muse, Alice Liddell, a photograph taken by Lewis Carroll in the garden of the Liddell family home when Alice was 7 years old. And this is also Alice Liddell in a photograph taken by Charles Dodgson when Alice was 7 years old. If anybody wants to discuss the implications of that in the break, let's have a conversation about what these two images tell us. What I'd like to put to you is the idea that 1865 was the watershed year for creative thinkers everywhere. It was the year when we were introduced to a landscape that we all now take for granted. It's impossible for us to imagine a world without Alice, but she was invented in 1865. So let's just take a look at some of the things that came to us in this moment. These things that we all have this illusion that these are timeless and have always been with us, but in fact they were all created by one man, one Victorian clergyman and lecturer in mathematics at Oxford. White rabbits were not perennially late, did not wear waistcoats, did not carry pocket watches until 1865. And in fact, in 1865, Alice was the very first person to go down the rabbit hole, a metaphor that we all use without even thinking about it to mean both escaping into a world of wonder and getting lost in a world of nonsense. And that was the very first time that it happened. And 7 years later, Alice also went through the looking glass. She was the very first person to make this journey, a journey that we all take it for granted now, that looking glasses are portals, that they're ways into another dimension. But until Alice first stepped through, they were just a way to see her own reflection. Caterpillars were not stoners, traditionally. Another little gift there from the high Victorian age. And if you've ever heard the phrase running to stand still, you're echoing the advice given by the Red Queen to Alice in the Garden of Looking Glass Land. If you actually want to get anywhere, of course, you have to go twice as fast. Jam tomorrow, jam yesterday, never jam today. We all know that phrase. It was first made in a job offer by the White Queen to Alice, who's inviting Alice to come and be her personal maid. She says Alice can have 2 pence a week and jam every other day, but it will never actually be jam today. Disney having a slightly disturbing moment here. I would like to say this, they are actually using paint, not blood, however horrific this might look. They're painting the roses. And again, this was the first time painting the roses happened, meaning to ineffectually cover up a mistake with a sort of pathetic myth that somehow you did the right thing. That they're painting in paint, but they're in fear of seeing their own blood spill because the Red Queen will cut their head off if she catches the roses being white and not red. Hatters and March hares have been mad for as long as hares have mated in the spring and hatters have used mercury to cure hat felt. But tea parties were not actually mad until Alice first sat down at the table with the Dormouse, the March Hare and the Hatter. And Alice was the very first person to nearly drown in a pool of her own tears. This is a conversation between Alice and Humpty Dumpty, and Humpty Dumpty is rather contemptuously handing down a whole lot of linguistic gifts to Alice. One of the gifts that he gives her is the word portmanteau, meaning to describe a word that contains two meanings. So soundscape and spork, brunch and blaxploitation are all examples of portmanteau words. The word portmanteau is in itself a portmanteau word, which is rather beautiful. It comes from something to carry your coat in, the French porter un manteau. And it was first given to us by Lewis Carroll. If you've ever been on the receiving end of a particularly badly told story and you've given the advice, begin at the beginning, go on until you reach the end, and then stop, you're actually echoing the advice given by the King of Hearts to the Mad Hatter, who's making an awful hash of giving his evidence in the trial of the Knave of Hearts. But it's not just in our everyday language and our everyday living that we draw on Alice. Thinkers of every kind, from every possible discipline, have cheerfully plundered the landscapes of Wonderland and Looking Glass to explain concepts to students. Wonderland and Looking Glass Land are filled with philosophical and logical jokes and complicated fallacies. And one of my very favourites is the moment when Alice, having eaten some of the mushroom from the caterpillar, finds herself growing very tall, and she grows up to the treetops where she meets a pigeon. And the pigeon instantly accuses her of being a serpent, trying to steal its eggs. And Alice, not being a serpent, says, no, I'm not a serpent, I'm a little girl. And the pigeon looks very cunning, and it says, ah, so you haven't eaten eggs then? And Alice, who is always honest, no matter what the consequences, says, well, yes, I have eaten the occasional egg. And the pigeon goes, ah, serpent, I knew it. You eat eggs, so you must be a serpent. Which is a beautiful illustration of what will happen when we argue from a false premise. Of course, it's not a surprise that a Victorian clergyman would make a connection between innocence and wickedness, between serpents and little girls. It might be a little bit more surprising that evolutionary biologists have found in the Red Queen theory the perfect metaphor to explain one of the paradoxes of evolution, which is that we have to do it just to stay where we are. Foxes get a little bit more cunning to catch more rabbits. Rabbits have to get a little bit faster to run away from foxes. And the net result is that about the same number of foxes will catch about the same number of rabbits. They're running to stand still. If they want to out-evolve each other, they have to go twice as fast. Why is it always jam tomorrow? Political economists of every complexion will be asking that question over the next 2 months as we count down to the May elections. And it's a very interesting question. And the answer is that until 1865, nobody actually knew about jam tomorrow. It's something that we all just assume we've talked about since we had words. Jam tomorrow, everybody must have had this. It actually came to us in 1865. One of the more obscure but rather beautiful examples of how Looking Glass can help people explain every concept comes to us from a moment when Alice is talking to her kitten at the beginning of Through the Looking Glass. And she says to her kitten, I wonder if looking glass milk would taste nice. And there's a very beautiful essay by Joanna O'Leary on the subject of isometric chemistry. And she's arguing in that actually looking glass milk wouldn't taste nice because some of the molecules in milk are stereoisomers and the rotated molecule would have an impact on the flavour. It's not often that you get to have a slide where you can put My Little Pony next to Silent Hill and then Homer Simpson in the corner. This is just to show how many of us have taken for granted this concept of going through to a parallel universe and discovering something else, going through the mirror, going through to another dimension. Again, the language of that, the idea of the looking glass universe, the mirror universe, comes to us from Alice's adventures. And I've chosen this slide because it illustrates the darkness, I think, that hovers around the edges of both Looking Glass Land and Wonderland. This is a moment when Alice is talking to the mock turtle, who, of course, is what you make mock turtle soup from. And this is just before, incidentally, he sings the most disturbing song you can imagine about soup that he's clearly going to be made into. He's boasting to Alice about how he has all the things that she has, and Alice is just saying, well, I have lessons, and the Mock Turtle says, oh yes, I had lessons, we had them under the sea, and we had 10 hours the first day and 9 hours the next, because they lesson, you see, go down 1 hour every day. And then Alice says, what happened on the 11th day? And the Gryphon says, no time for that, come on. But it's a very sinister question. What does happen on the 11th day? What happens when all these countdowns cycle down to 0? What will happen to the Mad Tea Party when everybody's moved around one place and you're back at the beginning? What will happen if the Jabberwocky ever breaks out of his bounds? Perhaps most disturbing of all is the illusion of the Red King when Alice is taken to see the sleeping Red King. And they say, shh, don't wake him. If you wake the Red King, every single one of us will disappear because he is dreaming us all. And if you ever wake him up, we'll all vanish like a candle that's been blown out. I started to make a list of all the people who I know have publicly acknowledged their debt to Alice. And after a while I thought, you know what? It's just everyone, all of us. If you look at the list, you will see people from every possible creative and scientific discipline. There are horror writers, there are filmmakers and game makers, literary writers, trash writers, filmmakers, scientists, political economists. Every single field of our lives is infused with this notion of Wonderland. I think what I'm trying to say is we're all just a bunch of thieves. We go into Wonderland and we steal this stuff, and we feel not the slightest guilt. I've done it myself. I have never written anything that wasn't influenced by Alice. And I don't care. I don't feel like I've robbed it. I feel like it belongs to me. And I'm sure we've all had that experience, this feeling that Wonderland somehow belongs to all of us. It's always been there. And that's really what I'd like to leave you with, is the question about what does this tell us about the creative process. This is somebody else's copyrighted material. It is out of copyright now, but clearly it was his property for a long time. He made it, he wrote it, this Victorian clergyman, never married, worked all his life at Christ Church College, Cambridge, at Oxford I should say, and we all just steal from him. What does that tell us about the creative process? So I'd like to close with a quotation from this character Ariadne, who appears in Christopher Nolan's 2001 film Inception. If you don't know the film, it's about a group of thieves, in fact, who break into people's dreams and steal information by manipulating what's happening within the dream. And Ariadne is an architect, which means that she builds dreamscapes that her colleagues can use to get into people's heads and to steal information. And she has a very interesting conversation with her mentor, Cobb. Cobb says to her, imagine you're designing a building. You consciously create each aspect, but sometimes it feels like it's almost creating itself, if you know what I mean. And Ariadne interrupts and she says, yeah, like I'm discovering it. Now what they're describing there is an illusion. But what I'd like to put to you today is actually maybe the illusion that we actually experience is the illusion that we create this stuff. There's a moment that I think every creative person will recognise, and Stephen King calls it the river of fire in your head. The moment when actually it is making itself, it is discovering itself, it's unfolding without you trying. What I'd like to leave you with is the thought that maybe that's what happened to Lewis Carroll when he wrote Alice in Wonderland. Maybe the reason why we all feel like we own it, why we all feel like it's always been there, is because actually it was always there. Are we ever creating anything in that moment? Do we create, or are we actually just discoverers of something that's always been waiting? Thank you.